Welcome to our series on What Will People Say? Understanding Domestic Violence in South Asian Homes. Our goal is to share support, information, and resources with individuals and families who are suffering or victims who are themselves victims of domestic violence. Please know that you are not alone. In this episode, we will discuss what the patterns of domestic violence look like and the ways in which they manifest. And importantly, what you should be looking for in terms of identifying domestic violence. Hello, my name is Rupa Khetarpal, and I've worked with trauma survivors as well as taught healthcare professionals about domestic violence. So I approached Pooja Krishna, who's a good friend and colleague of mine, to help me put together this podcast with the hope that this information reaches those who may be isolated or lack a support system here in the US. Or if they need information, or any of you, if you need information to help a loved one or a community member. Pooja is a co-founder of Maroon Oak, a community that empowers women through job opportunities and resources for finding work and adding skills.
Hi everyone, I'm Pooja, your anchor, and I'm privileged to bring the perspectives of those suffering from domestic violence. Rupa, thank you for creating this series to bring awareness and help for victims. Rupa brings nearly 2 decades of diverse experience working with trauma survivors. This includes domestic and sexual violence, child abuse and neglect, human trafficking, and other forms of interpersonal trauma. Rupa teaches at the School of Social Work at Rutgers University, New Jersey, and has also trained social work graduate students and healthcare professionals. In addition, Rupa also volunteers with several community organizations and nonprofits, particularly in the area of supporting women and children who are victims of family violence. Rupa, in the last episode, we talked about domestic violence and touched on different areas like forms of domestic violence, the scope, problem, its impact on individuals, as well as children and families. And why is it important to discuss domestic violence in South Asian families? So tell us a little bit more about what we are going to talk in this episode.
Right, Pooja. So in the last episode, I briefly mentioned these areas, and I'm hoping that in the upcoming episodes, we can talk more in detail about each of these and provide as much information for individuals and families so that they can really help themselves or help others. So this specific episode, we will be discussing in detail what the patterns of violence look like and the ways in which they manifest. So let me give you a little story as I begin. So I met with Anita when she was referred to me by her attorney, who was filing for a restraining order. So this was the third time that the police had responded to her home after she had called 911. So when I spoke with her, she appeared ashamed, almost guilty, as if she blamed herself for being in this current situation. So she explained that each time this had happened in the past, she had not pressed charges because she had hoped things would change. The first time this happened, he had lightly slapped her, she said. Unfortunately, it kept escalating until this time when I spoke with her, the last time that we met, when he had broken her nose and nearly killed her while trying to strangle her after they got into an argument. Unfortunately, Anita's case is not unusual. Domestic violence escalates, and often it is perpetrated in a cycle. And we often call it the cycle of violence, which we will be discussing more in detail.
Oh, so it's bad enough that it happens to a woman once or in any way. But you're saying that this is a cycle. So does this mean that this is something that often occurs in a pattern?
So, each situation, Pooja, is different, right? So there's no one way of sort of discussing or describing it. And the way that it occurs in relationships may also be very varied. However, we have learned that it often happens in a pattern that we call the cycle of violence. What that means is that the violence may occur in a repetitive pattern, right? So it repeats each time, and with every time the cycle sort of becomes bigger. So how does that happen, right? One may ask. So even though I discuss the cycle of violence, this is important to remember that this may not be the case for everyone. Not all domestic or family violence sort of examples fit within a sequential pattern, right? Nor does one, have to kind of go through the build-up phase before an incident. So it's just, it is a framework that we refer to, but it doesn't have to, every situation doesn't necessarily have to fit into this pattern.
Okay, so you said cycle. So in a cycle of violence, what should one look out for? I mean, as a professional, tell us or share with us if there are any indicators to tell us that a family situation may be escalating or there's something that they can do about it.
That's a really good question. And I think the cycle of violence quite often helps us identify what's happening within a relationship. So the first phase, we break it down into three phases. The first phase is called the tension building phase. This is where the tension between the people in the relationship starts to increase, and the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, all of that can occur within this phase. Then there is a standover phase where it can be really frightening for people who are experiencing abuse. They feel as though the situation will explode at any point of time, and if they do anything wrong. Quite often you must have heard somebody say, I'm walking on eggshells at home. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I'm on freeze or flight or fight moment all the time.
You're right.
This is the time that the behavior of the abuser intensifies, right? And it reaches a point where a release of the tension is sort of inevitable. So it's building up. For example, you sometimes, survivors will come and say that this is what he said right before it happened. Something like, "What's wrong with you? I don't want to go out with your friends or family. Why would you want me to go out with them?" Or, what I don't like for dinner. Or, why would you disrespect me in front of your friends? It's almost the cue to what's going to happen next. So this is the time where the tension you can feel is like really sort of building up to get to the next phase, which is the acute explosion phase. This is where the peak of violence is reached and the perpetrator experiences a release of tension, and this behavior may become habitual. This is the point where the actual assault happens or the actual domestic violence event happens. So that is the explosion point.
Okay, I get it. Rupa, breaking this down into the phases is actually very helpful to understand this. So you talked about the first two phases, which is tension building, and the second one, which you said there is a state of explosion. So how do things go from here? Because many times victims talk about how their partner is feeling remorseful and they're hopeful that maybe the situation will improve. Is that so, or is there more, or is there something more that they should be watching out for?
That is the most sort of the thing that keeps this thing happening over and over again, is the hope, right? The hope that things are going to change. And this speaks to the third phase, which we call as the honeymoon stage. So this is the point where the perpetrator may actually feel ashamed, right? They may become withdrawn, or they may try to justify their actions to themselves and to others, find ways to explain it, to excuse it. For example, they may say, it makes me angry when you say that. Why would you say that? Why would you make me so angry? Or why would you ask me that in front of everyone? It's somewhat sort of blaming the victim for the actual physical violence or the violence that had occurred. It's sort of shifting blame and not really taking accountability. And then there's the persuade stage where they're actively pursuing the victim, right? They're promising that, "Oh, I'm sorry, this is never going to happen again. I don't know how this happened. I don't know what made me do this to you. I'm so sorry." They may try to explain the violence by blaming other factors. I was very stressed at work, or I was intoxicated. I didn't know what I was doing. This is the stage where the perpetrator may feel very attentive to the person as well, who experienced the violence. So bringing gifts, flowers, helping around the house, helping with the children, for example, taking them out for dinner. So it could seem as though the perpetrator has really changed, that they're remorseful for what they've done, and they're promising not to do it again. And at this point, the person who has actually experienced the violence also feels very confused and hurt, but also relieved that the violence is over, right? So I'm sorry, I lose control when I get angry. So you hear these things and the person is like, anyway, it's over, it's done with, let's move to the next phase. And that's why we also call it the denial phase, because this is also the time that both the abuser and the victim are both sort of living in that space where they don't want to really deal with what just happened. And really don't want to face that what happened was very severe and unacceptable. So this is also the stage where the intimacy may increase, and people may feel happy and hopeful, and they want the relationship to continue. And so this is the phase where there's this idea that he's not going to do this again, or I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So this is all the thoughts that go into the person, right? Person's head when this is happening. So with the perpetrator apologizing, giving gifts, making promises to go and seek help, begging the victim, to stay, and sometimes they even threaten suicide and say, I'm going to kill myself if you leave me, or I will die if you leave me, I cannot live without you, and all of these promises that are made. And this is what the victim wants to believe, right? And that the perpetrator is sorry, that things are going to change. And they probably genuinely love the perpetrator and they want things to work out. So this is a very difficult point of time for them. At other times, they may want to leave, but then there are barriers to leaving the situation. And so the cycle continues. And we know from research that it takes about 9 times on an average for a person to leave an abusive relationship until they can finally leave. So that sort of speaks to the difficulty in making the decision, even though they may be in this you know, cyclic pattern of violence over and over again, it still becomes very difficult to leave.
This is very enlightening. The fact that the situation doesn't always go forward, but it goes back, but then it escalates and becomes much worse. And Rupa, your examples and the real life situations really help us understand this. But one more thing, a lot of people probably don't understand the triggers or recognize that this is a repeating pattern, maybe till it's too late. So do you think that there is any way that the victims may be able to recognize these patterns and go ahead, reach out for help before things turn worse, way worse for them?
Yeah, that's really important, Pooja. What you ask right now is something that we really need to talk about, because, sometimes even when you recognize that something is happening repeatedly, you keep hoping that things will change. As human beings, hope is something that keeps us sane and surviving, right? So the next time he won't do this to me, or I'm going to be able to stop him, or my family member is going to speak with him, something is going to change. So I'll give you an example. I was working with this young woman from India many years ago. So Lata had been married for 3 months and she was living in New Jersey with her husband. So what started as pushing and poking with his elbow over, little things, whenever he became upset with her, either because of her cooking skills, or as he said, that she didn't have any cooking skills, it quickly escalated to open-handed slaps and then close-fisted punches to every part of her body. Ultimately, in a very short period of 3 months, when the police found her after she had called 911 on the advice of a family friend, who basically told her that if you don't call 911, you're going to die, she was found lying on the floor of her bedroom when the police responded with multiple broken ribs, because that morning her husband had stomped on her before he left for work. There were burn marks on her from hot ladles being applied to her arms,
Oh my
and she
goodness.
had bite marks all over her body. And she was starved for nearly about 4 days. She hadn't had anything to eat as punishment because he had caught her taking food from the refrigerator without his permission. Now, when I say this, this may sound unbelievable when I, talk about this story, but I distinctly remember asking her when I met with her why she didn't call the police earlier, because this was happening for 3 months, right? And she hadn't called the police. And why did this happen when she nearly died? And she said, well, I didn't know I could. Think about that. I asked her, why didn't you call the police? And she said, I didn't know I could. This is a constant reminder to me in the work that I do and that many of us do in this field.
And you're right, this is truly unbelievable that that can happen to someone. So here, as you said, the key is then being aware that sometimes things can go worse. And there may be clear signs that they are, but at other times there might be no such signs. So how can victims and families recognize the lethality or the fact that the abuse can actually take their lives or harm them terribly, and the fact that it can all escalate very quickly? So maybe today you're not in a precarious situation, but tomorrow is not certain by any means. How can the victims and families recognize and be watchful?
So just like, I was mentioning earlier that there's no one case scenario that captures all the relationships. It's very difficult to identify the same behaviors in all of these, right? However, we have
Okay.
learned from our, professional experiences and from research and working with victims and survivors and their families that it's sometimes the abuse develops in a relationship over time. And it's through careful and manipulative tactics used by the perpetrator and sometimes by their families as well. As we know, in South Asian families, often family members are involved. And sometimes it escalates quickly over a very short period of time. But the bottom line is it escalates. That is one thing that we are certain about. So Lata, the woman I was speaking about earlier, who was, being physically and emotionally abused, didn't want to tell her parents back home about what was going on here in the US because she didn't want them to worry, right? And in her mind, what could they possibly do to help her other than worry? And she didn't have any extended family members or friends here whom she could, confide in. She was not aware of a system and how she could call the police for help or anyone for help. And more importantly, she thought that he would begin appreciating her and stop hurting her. Well, we know how that went. So for us, the message that we learned from that was that any abuse, first of all, is undeserved. It's not anybody's fault, no matter what happened. It wasn't their
Right.
fault that they were abused, right? And the second piece of that is it does not stop by itself. Unless the abuser takes responsibility and wants to actively change their behaviors, goes and seeks help, professional help, it does not change, right? So we have to remember that this is something that needs to be addressed. It doesn't just go away by itself. In the next episode, we will explore this further, understanding the absence of patterns and the ways that you might encounter these behaviors. Thank you all for listening to us. Please stay safe and please know that you're not alone.
Thank you, friends, for tuning in today. We hope to bring you lots more information and expert advice in our future episodes too. Please subscribe to this channel so you can be notified about our future episodes. You can also find information and resources in the notes for this episode. From all of us here, take care and stay safe. Thank you.